Back to the legislative package, the blueprint for a better America. I want to take a minute to look over some of the things that are in this legislative package so that we have a better sense of what exactly these political goals are. The legislative package is broken down into 5 titles, one for each of the 5 duties in the Constitution, starting with establish justice. And it's broken down into 3 subtitles, one for police reforms, one for prosecutorial reforms, one for prison reforms. And the George Floyd Justice Act takes up a lot of the issues that are wrong with our police system, like qualified immunity, reforms that and eliminates that for the police, requires that they be trained on a duty to intervene, restricts them from using chokeholds, teaches them de-escalation. It ends the 1033 program that puts military equipment on our city streets, restricts the use of no-knock warrants, reforms the use of cash bail. It ends federal civil asset forfeiture and essentially ends state civil asset forfeiture completely. In addition, we establish a national police misconduct registry. The Weldon Angeles Justice Act is the part that ends the federal war on drugs. This becomes a state's issue, just the same way as when we ended alcohol prohibition. States were free to set their own policies around alcohol. Many of them legalized it right away. Some of them didn't. Kansas stayed dry until like World War II. And so this uses sort of the same model by repealing the Controlled Substances Act and wiping the drug laws off of from the United States Code. States can set their own policies. We ensure that this is retroactive, that banks are able to take money from legal recreational sales. A 12% sales tax is imposed on recreational sales, and it's used to fund the Drug War Restorative Justice Office, which will make treatment services available to anyone who wants or needs them. Drug use is not harmless, but the war on drugs causes far more harm than drug use does. And so to offset the harms of drug use, we're going to make sure treatment services are available. And then the FDA would be in charge of setting up a rulemaking authority to regulate the purity and quality of recreational drug sales. A little more that's included in here, clarifying the Espionage Act, which has been used to go after whistleblowers such as Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, Reality Winner, and others. Repeal mandatory minimums, wipe those from the United States Code, clarify the Real ID Act so it's not can't be used as a national ID card system. The Matthew Charles Prison Reform Act improves conditions for the millions and millions of incarcerated Americans that wake up behind bars every single day by restoring access to Pell Grants, helping ensure they have identification when they leave incarceration, and for federal prisoners, enacting second look legislation so that after 10 years they can get ask for a review of their sentence, where if a judge found that they were not a danger to anyone, that they were ready to re-enter society, and that the interest of justice warranted it, they could reduce an incarcerated person's sentence. And restricting the use of solitary confinement, which is locking someone up for 22 or more hours a day. And we have tens of thousands of people in this country who are locked up for days, weeks, months, even years at a time in solitary confinement in violation of United Nations standards. And so this legislation would bring us up to United Nations standards and on the federal level, and then incentivize states to do the same thing. The second title is Ensuring Domestic Tranquility, and it puts in a truce on guns and abortion for 10 years. And both sides, everybody gets something, everybody gives something up. We codify the Hyde Amendment and pass universal background checks. In exchange, no gun bans or abortion bans could be introduced by Congress for the next 10 years. So no more threatening that you've got to vote for the lesser of two evil parties or the other one is going to take your guns or abortions away. We're just going to take that off the table while we address root problems that are driving so many needless deaths. And then it would make it a criminal offense a Class B misdemeanor. So if Congressman really wanted to do this, they could do it as an act of civil disobedience and spend a week in jail as a sign of their commitment to trying to ban guns or abortions if they need to lay it up for their audience. Title III is providing for the common defense, and we have far out exceeded the framers' mandate. They were very concerned about standing armies when they wrote the Constitution. That's why they restricted Congress from appropriating money for armies for more than 2 years at a time. And there was talk of adding provisions that would have required essentially a 2/3 vote in order to have a standing army. But we've gotten far away from that, and we'll talk a little bit more about why a little bit later on. So in this legislative package, the first part is reducing America's global military footprint by repealing the authorizations for military force that from decades ago that we're still using as sort of a blank check on military adventures around the world. Requiring congressional authorization for use of force against Iran, reducing our military budget with a mandatory 10% cut for 4 consecutive years. That would bring things back down to 2005 levels at the height of the Iraq War, and reducing the number of our foreign military bases by requiring the Secretary of Defense to hold local referendums, and essentially ask the people, do you want us here? And if they say no, then we respect their wishes, close our bases, and leave. That is the low-hanging fruit when it comes to closing our hundreds and hundreds of foreign military bases. And then the last part of this subtitle reduces our nuclear stockpile by 50% and prohibits spending money on upgrading our nuclear weapons, and instead extends the life of the existing ones so that hopefully we can move quickly towards a world that doesn't need nuclear weapons. As far as improving America's moral standing in the world, we restrict the use of economic sanctions against civilian populations. This preys on the weakest, most vulnerable members of society. Economic sanctions against an entire country are essentially a group punishment, which is prohibited by the United Nations. So we restrict the use of economic sanctions, end the arms transfers to Saudi Arabia and our support for their war on Yemen. That's been going on for 8 years, and Yemen can't wait. So we'll block the United States from supporting that in these 2 sections. We also improve our moral standing by prohibiting purchases of landmines or the development of lethal autonomous weapons, and by closing Guantanamo Bay military prison, which is the fact that we have held people there without charges for 2 decades. Really makes a mockery of the idea of liberty and justice for all. Title 4 is promoting the general welfare, and it's got a lot of sections and details because this is a very specific proposal. It establishes a public health insurance option and gets rid of the mandate on large employers to require health insurance, since people will have another option. Requires the negotiation of prescription drug prices, something that's very popular with the people, and yet Congress can't seem to manage it because the drug companies spend $100 million lobbying them to not pass it. We enact paid family leave, 18 weeks of paid family leave, paid for by a 0.25% payroll tax on employees and employers. American Union Banking sets up digital treasury accounts to bring all Americans into the banking system, and authorizes the post office to offer financial services. If you like your bank account, you can keep it, but this would be a free public alternative to get people out of the banking system if they want. The American Union Jobs Program is universal basic income. It makes Americans independent contractors in order to fulfill the constitutional duties as however they see fit. It is not a jobs program in a traditional sense. You can't be fired any more than you can be fired from being an American. It is universal basic income, and at $1,300 a month for adults plus $433 for kids, that would replace the child tax credit program. And the offsets for universal basic income come through a 12% value added tax. The American Union Legal Defense is a voucher system for legal services, so that people who are incarcerated and drawn into the criminal justice system would be able to would get vouchers to purchase services, and it will be funded by a tax on lawyers. So taxing them, and they can get the money back by providing services to those who need it. The last title is securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. The way that we do that is through voting. Legislation includes universal suffrage, so that every one citizen, one vote, end of story. And to protect this country and the environment for our posterity, pollution fees also serve as a clawback for the universal basic income program through a carbon fee and a plastic fee. And so that's what's in those are the 50 policies essentially that are in the legislative package. What are the problems? What does the military industrial complex do? Why is it beneficial for the country? And the answer is that it solves the problem of distributing money out across the country. We've got the missile silos. Right now, there's these states out here. There's hundreds and hundreds of missile silos that create jobs in these rural economies where people stop, the servicemen who are going to sit in those silos, they stop at the local restaurants and the convenience stores and stuff before they go in, and they spend money. Military bases out there. And so if we're going to downsize the military, we've got to be able to address that problem. We've got to be able to solve that same problem of getting money out across the country. Sort of like the water cycle, where water flows downhill, and so it tends to collect in the rich wealthy areas like New York and the big cities. Money flows downhill to there, and like the way the water cycle draws in the water vapor and then spreads it back out again as rain and snow. It snows back out in the mountains, and then as the snow melts, it comes back and pools back in the lakes and through the rivers, and so universal basic income will do this sort of the same thing. It will help through the value added tax. It will help draw money from those reservoirs in the big city and make sure that it's distributed around the country and replace that function of the military industrial complex. I've got a quote here on how the military industrial complex feeds the economy. And so coming back to universal basic income, the American Union Jobs Program. Again, this is not a jobs program in the traditional sense. You can't get fired. It is universal basic income. It is unconditional. But it is a reminder that Americans have these duties to each other. And it's a reminder to be a better American. However people choose to fulfill those duties is up to them. The government isn't looking to micromanage people's lives. Again, this is universal and unconditional. People can figure out how best to meet their own needs better than the government. Now, in a nation of 300 million Americans, some people are going to make poor decisions, but by ensuring that people have enough resources to meet their basic needs, we are fulfilling our constitutional duty to provide for the general welfare. Universal basic income also is a political solution, but it also promotes social and cultural reforms, because the economic insecurity drives an awful lot of problems in our country. Right now, we've got about 40 million Americans who are living below the poverty line, and another 100 million that are struggling, that aren't sure how they would meet an unexpected $400 expense. And that mindset of scarcity, of worrying, am I going to have enough? Is there enough? And worrying, people are stealing the mindset of scarcity drives an awful lot of problems in this country too. This is sort of the anti-immigration theme of there's not enough jobs to go around. We got to keep other people out, and so it feeds back into some of those cultural problems that we talked about, the greed and the hoarding mindset. And so universal basic income, by being unconditional, is a statement of faith and security in everyone. and saying, look, the American people are in this together. We're going to look out for each other. We're going to make sure that nobody falls below the poverty line. And when we shift into that mindset of abundance, we'll be able to address a lot of our other problems collectively. A mindset of scarcity makes us kind of keep our heads down. It's harder to think long term about larger issues when you've got to focus on the problem in front of you. Universal basic income, by being universal, it recognizes the value in each and every one of us. These are some of the social and cultural problems that we have right now, where certain economic, racial, or cultural groups are demonized or devalued. And then going back to other social reforms that are needed, strengthening families. Universal basic income, as wages have stagnated for so many Americans over the last 5 decades, the real growth in family income has come from switching over to two-parent income, or two-income families. And that has other consequences on how kids grow up. And there's not a parent home with them. And so universal basic income can strengthen families by giving parents more choices, like having a parent stay home with the kids instead of seeking employment. The other planks of ending mass incarceration and ending the endless wars also promote social and cultural reforms by giving more focus on justice, where there's a certain amount of blame and cancel culture kind of thing that we have going on in this country. And by shifting our focus on instead to what is justice, what should we be doing, how do we make sure people are treated fairly. Also by reducing the focus on violent solutions that the military makes palatable. A couple of years ago, after the school shooting in Parkland, Florida, Matt Taibbi wrote a piece called "If We Want the Kids to Stop Killing, the Adults Have to Stop Too." And he focused on how the military-industrial complex glorifies violence, and we make it seem acceptable to use force and violence to solve problems, and how that culture then leads to greater number of school shootings and mass shootings. By reducing our military footprint, we can shift our focus on cooperatively solving problems instead of through forceful solutions, as well as recognizing a wider vision of humanity, of recognizing that the people in Cuba, who back in the 1950s, right, had a revolution, and we may disapprove of their socialist revolution, but to continue to penalize an entire country for decades and decades and decades for something that 2/3 of the people in Cuba weren't even alive when it happened, and to continue to punish them through economic sanctions. We need to shift that focus. We need to recognize the humanity in everyone. And so these policies will help do that as well. The Blueprint for a Better America is not intended to solve all problems. It's not intended to be all things to all people. Instead, it's like the Constitution was when the framers wrote it back in 1787. It is a compromise, and it is a good faith offer to do the things that America needs to do. And so while nobody likes everything that is in the legislative package, including me, so far it seems like people like on average, like at least 80% of it. And so we can all come out ahead. Some of the people who want to end mass incarceration and the endless wars don't care about ending poverty. Some people don't want to downsize the military. Some people don't want to end mass incarceration or the war on drugs. But this is how things get done in Congress, is they get lumped into one legislative package, one take it or leave it offer. And so we can use that same model by making this one take it or leave it offer for all the candidates for Congress in 2022. And that's how we can get this to the president's desk. As the framers intended, we can hold Congress directly accountable. And right now, what we do is we tend to hold them accountable by party affiliation. I've been paying attention to politics for a quarter century, and I've seen the political pendulum swing back and forth, where people recognize, okay, we've got Republicans in charge and they're doing a terrible job, so let's hold them accountable and put Democrats in charge. Oh, they're doing terrible. Well, we can hold them accountable by putting Republicans back in charge. And we bounce back and forth, and it doesn't solve the problems that need to be solved. And so rather than just swinging things from left to right, creating our own metric, crowdsourcing our own set of legislative demands, our own political platform, we can move this country forward instead of just going from side to side. The new metric for holding Congress accountable, a new metric for voting besides party affiliation. That anyone is expected to like everything in here, but when you serve in the legislature, you frequently have to vote for things that aren't 100%, you don't support 100%. But when you are a legislator, you have a responsibility to make sure that things get done, that things get passed. You can't just say no to everything. You're responsible for governing. And so this is an opportunity to pressure Congress to step up their responsibility and get back to those constitutional duties and solve some of these problems. And so the way that we do this is as the American Union of Swing Voters. A swing voter is someone who's willing to vote for either a Republican or a Democrat. And as a union of voters, swing voters have the greatest influence on elections. You know, we can go back and look at our last couple of presidential elections where 50,000 people across a handful of battleground states, if they had voted in the opposite direction, the outcome would have been reversed. You find that time and time again. Even going back to like the 2000 election, and we talk about Florida and the Bush and Gore and the recounts and everything. But even in New Hampshire, if 7,000 people had voted the other way in New Hampshire, Al Gore would have won the presidency. Swing voters are the ones who have the greatest influence. And so by seizing that power, we can use it to leverage that into political influence. So the second part of political reforms, writing our own legislation keeps it outside the swamp of Washington. When they write their legislation, lobbyists get their dirty little fingers all over it. And by doing it outside of the swamp and presenting it to them as a rubber stamp for their rubber stamp, we can avoid those kind of issues and problems and make sure that people are really looked after. As far as social reforms, offering these solutions to politicians of both parties is going to reduce partisanship because, again, Republicans and Democrats aren't going to like everything in here, but it's a good faith offer to candidates of both parties. And politicians love to get elected. And so if this block of swing voters is the difference between them winning or losing the race that they're in, they will find ways to persuade themselves that getting elected by supporting this is the best course of action for them. This brings people together with a positive message based on shared American values. Again, the Constitution is our common ancestor. And so by focusing on constitutional duties, these are the things that Americans should be able to agree on that we're supposed to be doing. Why it's front and center in the Constitution. And these support the cultural reforms as well. Accepting a compromise, it tempers our greed to say, look, I'm not going to get everything I want, but that's okay. And emphasizing on the duties in the Constitution, it shifts our focus away from self-centeredness. Instead of focusing on what everyone owes me, focusing on what do we owe each other. When it comes to the political strategy, third parties don't work because in order to win a single seat in Congress, they need 35% of the vote. And many of these districts around the country, about 90% of them are gerrymandered so that they're going to produce a Republican or a Democrat in the general election year after year. But when it comes to swing voters, it just takes a small percentage to control the balance of power. And so by having one single set of demands for all 469 federal races, we can shape the national conversation. And a 3.5% voting bloc can control half a dozen U.S. Senate seats and a dozen or more House seats. Because in 2022, we're focused on these 10 states where they all have a U.S. Senate seat up for grabs and competitive House races. Again, I'm based in North Carolina. where we don't even need 3.5% in order to control the outcome of that Senate race. We need about 2%. Some of the other ones are very close. In Georgia last year, you might remember the Senate runoffs, where 2 U.S. Senate seats went to runoffs in January of 2021. And in the 8 weeks of that campaign, the major parties and then the special interests and the various political groups spent $800 million to try and influence the outcome of those races. And they got 4.5 million people to turn out and vote for those 2 Senate runoffs. But at the end of the day, it was 29,000 people. If 29,000 people had voted the other way, the Republicans would control the U.S. Senate right now. And so this is where the power is. And by focusing on being the deciders, that's the way that we get the leverage to frame the national conversation around solutions into poverty and mass incarceration and to the endless wars. These are goals that resonate with large numbers of people. I've spent many hours out canvassing in grocery store parking lots and things like that. And yes, people want to see problems solved, and they've lost hope that we can do that. But we can restore hope by bringing this message around the country. We've got palm cards, yard signs. Again, we've got targeted districts where swing voters can have the maximum influence, and that's how we can generate the political pressure to promote this set of legislative solutions. And this 2022 campaign concludes with a fast for peace on October 15th, 2022. This is the opportunity for all Americans who are willing to pool their votes to collectively bargain for a better social contract are invited to participate in this fast moral pressure. And essentially, we're holding our own election across social media using the hashtag #FastForPeace to say, look, something has to be done. And even though we don't like everything that's in this legislative package, we are willing to compromise, because fasting and compromise are 2 sides of the same coin. They're willingly giving something up. And when 3.5% of Americans are willing to do that, we will have the political influence to get leverage over Congress. Now, for candidates for Congress who want this block of votes, that they are willing to accept the blueprint. And this isn't, you might remember how back in December 2020, Congress passed a 5,593-page legislative package. And they can use the same mechanism they did then to put our legislative package in front of the House and Senate, where they take a bill that has been to committee of conference, strip the text out of that, and put the new language in it, and then it goes to the House and to the Senate for a straight up or down vote. And they can use that same mechanism to put our legislative package before both chambers. And candidates for Congress who are willing to accept these terms, they have 10 days. 10 days to advance the legislation before the midterms. This is the advantage to flipping the model around and crowdsourcing our own legislation, is that we have a very specific way to hold them accountable. We don't have to take the promises of Congress and say, elect us and we'll do this. We've already established what exactly it is we want them to do. They just have to act. And if they do that before the election, they can earn our votes. If they fail to do it, then that is their choice. They have refused. They have decided to keep poverty, keep mass incarceration, and keep the endless wars. Now, this is the best way to de-escalate the 2022 election. This is the best way to create a peaceful resolution instead of having a hateful, partisan, bitter, contested election. We can rally Americans around solutions. And so when we control the balance of power in Congress, hopefully we can paint them into a corner where Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell, they all look at each other and like, oh crap, we're actually going to have to solve some problems because the American people aren't willing to let us off the hook. And if they refuse to act, then their challengers, who on October 15th participated in the fast and asked for our endorsement, signified their willingness to accept the blueprint, they can earn these votes if Congress fails to act. If Congress does act, then challengers who have taken up our terms and have gotten what they've asked for are expected to put their campaign aside for 2022 and support the incumbents. Now, if both candidates were to reject these terms, then the endorsement may be awarded randomly. The power of a union of swing voters is being the deciders, and so deciders accept the responsibility for making a decision. But this lesser of two evils game is tearing America apart. It's horrible for our collective well-being to have candidates constantly pointing fingers at each other and saying they're evil, they're evil. And so by awarding endorsements randomly, we can avoid that game and saying, look, somebody's got to be in charge. We're going to decide who, but not because you're the lesser of two evils, but we're going to put you in charge on a vote of no confidence. And in 2 years, you had better meet our terms. You had better put our legislation forward, or we're going to do the same thing to you. It will establish us as a bargaining unit for the American people when we decide the outcome of these elections. So that is the 2022 political strategy of how a union of swing voters, how the smallest number of people can have the maximum amount of influence, and how they can advance those three legs of the constructive program: the political reforms, cultural reforms, and social reforms. So when it comes to calls for action, all three of these things can be addressed. As far as political outreach, this is a different paradigm. We need people who will focus on their own candidates for Congress, both the challenger and the incumbent, and shepherd them through this idea of specific legislative action in exchange for votes, and this concept of returning power to the people to control Congress. You know, when the framers wrote the Constitution, the only thing that they could figure out how to do was to put everybody in one room to hash things out. And that was true back in the 18th century. But it's not true in the 21st century. We can crowdsource functional government. We can decentralize the legislative process, and we can take it back. We just need, as a union of swing voters, gives us a way to leverage our influence. To writing that legislation, we need people who are willing to review these legislative details. We've got a couple of subcommittees on each of those two subtitles within Title III. So if you're interested in the ending the endless wars, or ending mass incarceration, or promoting the general welfare by ending poverty, we have a total of 8 different subcommittees that are working on various legislative parts. So if you're interested, we need help with that. And then as far as this is a political campaign, so we need voter outreach. So through canvassing, showing up at different events, putting out yard signs, sharing the message on social media, all those kind of things to let the American people know that there is a third way to vote besides Republican and Democrat, besides the lesser of two evils game, that there's a different way to have political influence. The social outreach, again, breaking down these partisan barriers, and so persuading, helping third parties. Third parties don't work as a practical matter, but they're very good on principled matters because they can afford to stand for something, whereas our two-party system, the parties just stand for opposing the other one. And so helping third parties see that, yeah, they can get 80% of what they want in this legislative package, and by bringing their votes to the table, by joining the American Union, that's how they can achieve a lot of the things that they want to see done. Raising money by having people join the American Union with a monthly pledge to the PAC of $5 a month or more. As a super PAC, none of this money will ever go to any of the candidates or their campaigns. It only goes to grow the American Union and spread this message of cooperating to solve problems. And that reinforcing the social reforms of working together instead of against each other. And then as far as the cultural outreach, again, offering solutions based on duties. framing the message in a way of what do we owe each other? What are we supposed to be doing? Instead of framing the question of what are the rights that other people owe me? Promoting the monthly fast for peace. Again, the fast is a way to a shared self-sacrifice to bring us together, and as a fast of moral pressure to inspire Congress to act, to get things done if they want to stay in Congress. Some of the other opportunities are coming up. The Poor People's Campaign is having a huge event in Washington, D.C. on June 18th. If you know people who are in the area, we need help canvassing and doing outreach with the crowd there. And that, I think, pretty much concludes this presentation for the Campaign for Peace. Yeah, I was going to say the first step is joining the American Union and making the token $5 a month and saying that you're willing to vote for either Republican or Democrat in theory. And by the time you see the final legislative package, if there's something in there that doesn't work, just making a good faith agreement to work together. What joining is about. So.